I've never been one to care about New Year's Eve parties. For me, it was just noisy nights that marked the passage of time. But that invitation changed everything. An exclusive ball, in a place that no one seemed to know, promising to be the most unforgettable night of my life. I should have figured that unforgettable doesn't always mean something good. Before we start, turn off the lights, grab your headphones, and click subscribe to support the channel. That way, you don't miss any of our stories. Ready? So, take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear can change the way you look at New Year's Eve. The letter arrived on an ordinary December afternoon, buried under piles of bills and advertisements. It was different. A thick paper envelope, sealed with a golden wax seal, like something out of a Victorian novel. My name was written in elegant handwriting, but I didn't recognize the sender. Inside, the invitation was as extravagant as the envelope. You are cordially invited to the grand New Year's ball, a night of music, dance, and secrets. Location: Saleo de Raspiel. Time: 10 p.m. The name of the place seemed strange to me. A spiel? He had never heard of such a place, and even after Googling, nothing appeared. But somehow, it only increased my curiosity. Who would send something so elaborate? Why for me? On the night of December 31st, I put on my best outfit. Curiosity was stronger than common sense. The address of the invitation led me to an ancient road, winding through dark hills. My GPS seemed to hesitate, as if even it didn't know where I was going. When I finally arrived, I was greeted by a stately mansion, surrounded by mist, with lights flickering through the windows. The door of the mansion opened with a deep, heavy sound, as if it hadn't been used in decades. A woman dressed in black, with a smile as still as a mask, led me inside. The interior was stunning, but it carried a sense of oppression. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, illuminating a vast hall with walls covered in antique mirrors. Red velvet rugs muffled my steps as I moved forward, trying not to stare at my reflection for too long. Something in the mirrors seemed wrong. The other guests were already there, scattered around the room. They all wore formal attire, but there was something old-fashioned about their clothes, as if they were from a different era. No one seemed to be really having a good time. The conversation was almost murmured, the smiles tense. In the center of the room, a huge mirror stood out. Its gilded frame was ornamented with intricate, almost vivid designs, and it seemed to capture the light in a strange way, reflecting not only the hall, but something beyond, something that shouldn't be there. The host, a tall man with piercing eyes and an impeccable suit, appeared at the top of the stairs. He raised a glass and said, in a voice that echoed like soft thunder, "Welcome to the Hall of a Spiel. Tonight, we are more than mere spectators. We are part of history." The phrase bothered me, but before I could think about it anymore, the song started playing. A slow waltz filled the air, and the couples began to dance. I didn't know anyone, but it was impossible not to be attracted by the atmosphere. As I watched the hall, I noticed something strange. The reflections in the mirrors did not follow the movements of the people. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was definitely happening. I looked at the central mirror, and my heart froze. In the reflection, I was dancing, but my feet were still on the ground. I moved away from the central mirror, my heart beating out of rhythm. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of light, an illusion caused by the strange glow in the hall. But every fiber of my body screamed that this was more than a coincidence. I continued wandering around the room, trying to appear uninterested as I watched the other guests. Their expressions had something of emptiness, as if they danced out of pure obligation. And then I started noticing disturbing details. A woman in a blue dress passed me repeatedly, always in the same movement. A man near the drinks table seemed to be laughing at something, but the sound of his laughter never reached my ears. The most unsettling thing was the reflection in the mirror behind me. It was me, but something was wrong. My reflection seemed to be watching me, his eyes a little darker, his posture more rigid. As I tried to walk away, I bumped into a waiter carrying a tray. The glasses broke, the sound echoing like a scream in the silence that followed. All eyes in the room turned to me, but only for a moment. Soon, they resumed their conversations and dances, as if nothing had happened. The host approached. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Is everything okay?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. I just mumbled an apology and turned to get out of there, but he put a firm hand on my shoulder. Disturbing for those who are not used to it, but I guarantee that it only reflects what we want to see. "There's nothing to worry about." Before I could answer, he pointed to a door next to the hall. "But I recommend that you come back before midnight. The show is just beginning." Spectacle? The word made me shudder. I walked into the lounge without a second thought, grateful to escape the presence of this man, even temporarily. The lounge was smaller, but equally decorated with mirrors. As I sat down, I noticed that one of them was slightly blurry, as if someone had breathed into it. There was a written word, almost erased, but still legible. "Flee." I stood up immediately, panic growing. Something was terribly wrong in that place, and time seemed to be running out. But where would I go? And why did I feel that all roads would lead me back to the central mirror? Back in the hall, the atmosphere had changed. The air was heavier, the music slower, almost funereal. The guests were still dancing, but their movements seemed mechanical, like puppets hanging from invisible wires. The central mirror seemed to pulsate with an energy of its own, and I couldn't look away. It was as if he was calling out to me, whispering secrets I shouldn't hear. It was then that I saw something that made me lose my breath. In the reflection, the hall was not filled with elegant dancers. It was empty and dark, except for warped shadows that moved as if they were alive. My reflection was there, but it wasn't me. He turned to face me, and I saw that his eyes were completely black. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. I located the host at the top of the stairs, watching the room with a satisfied smile. I climbed the steps, ignoring the gazes of the other guests, or the reflections that now moved independently of their bodies. "Who are these people? What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't seem surprised by my question. In fact, he looked. "You noticed, didn't you?" he said, his voice so calm it sounded like a melody. "It's a reunion. Everyone here has a connection with this place, with this mirror, including you." I shook my head, refusing to accept his words. He stepped forward, and for a moment, his expression turned gloomy. "For years, maybe you have forgotten, but the mirror does not forget. He keeps memories, desires, sins." My thoughts swirled. How could I have a connection to this place? It was then that he pointed to the center mirror. "He will show the truth." Against my will, I approached the mirror. The room around me disappeared, replaced by a scene that made me shudder. It was me many years ago, younger but unmistakably me. I was at a similar ball, laughing and dancing, until something went terribly wrong. The mirror exploded, fragments flying everywhere, as screams filled the air. "You were here the night it all started," said the host behind me. "And now you're here to finish." The pieces began to fall into place. The hall, the guests, the mirror, it was all part of something bigger, something I didn't yet fully understand. But one thing was certain. I wasn't just a guest. I was part of it. My mind was spinning as I stared into the mirror. It now showed scenes that seemed plucked from a nightmare, distorted shadows dancing, faces that weren't fully human, and at the center of it all, I. The host's voice echoed behind me. "The mirror doesn't just reflect. He guards. Each soul that enters this hall leaves a part of itself, and some they can never get out." Suddenly, I realized what was happening. Those guests were not normal people. They were echoes, prisoners of the mirror, repeating the same night, year after year. And now he wanted me to join them. "I don't belong here," I shouted, taking a step back. The host just smiled, and then the whole room seemed to change. The mirrored walls began to crack, revealing darkness behind. The guests stopped dancing and turned to me, their faces completely blank except for glowing black eyes. I ran towards the door through which I had entered, but it was no longer there. The hall seemed to fold in on itself, each exit leading back to the central mirror. The host continued to stand at the top of the stairs, watching as if he were a conductor conducting his macabre orchestra. Finally, I realized that there was only one way out. "If that's what you want, I'll go," I shouted, my voice echoing in the void. With all the strength I had, I ran towards the mirror. The moment my hand touched the cold surface, everything turned white. I felt like I was being pulled into a whirlwind, my body floating between memories that weren't mine and voices whispering things I couldn't understand. When I regained consciousness, I was back in my car, parked on the road where it all began. The clock on the dashboard read 11:59 p.m. For a moment, I thought that it had all been a dream, until he looks at the passenger seat. There was the invitation, with the golden seal intact. And in the rearview mirror, for just a moment, I saw something. My reflection smiled, but I wasn't smiling. I never thought that a watch could cause me fear. To me, they were just ordinary objects, marking the time of our lives, silent and harmless. But everything changed the night I inherited that old clock, an object that, according to my grandfather, should never have been touched by human hands again. It was a family gift, or at least that's what I thought. It was old, with the metal darkened by time, and the hands seemed frozen, as if they had long ago decided to stop fighting against the passing of seconds. That first night, as I placed it on the shelf in the living room, I felt something strange. A shiver ran down my spine, as if the clock itself was watching my every move. The sound of a faint ticking began to echo, even though the hands were motionless. At that moment, I realized that this was not just a watch. And as the sound of the ticking filled the darkness around me, something inside me said he was waiting. Waiting for midnight. My grandfather was always a reserved man. When he passed away, he left few instructions on how to handle his belongings. Among the antique furniture and dusty books, the clock was there, wrapped in a red velvet cloth, as if someone wanted to hide its macabre glow. My mother was categorical. "Don't touch it. Your grandfather used to say that this watch brings bad luck." But I couldn't resist. There was something about him that caught my attention. The design was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Intricate gears visible behind cracked glass, hand-engraved Roman numerals, and a Latin inscription on the base, Tempus Mortis. I took the watch home more out of curiosity than sentimental value. He did not believe in superstitions. It was just an object, I thought, something that might be worth something at auction. That night, something seemed out of place. The clock, which until then had been motionless, began to emit an almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't exactly a ticking, but a subtle vibration, like the flapping of an insect's wings trapped in glass. The air around me became heavy. Even sitting alone in the living room, he felt as if he was being watched. I looked at the clock and saw that the hands had moved, just a few seconds, but enough to make me freeze. Suddenly, a memory popped into my mind. My grandfather, sitting in his armchair, muttering to himself about the price of stolen time. At the time, I thought he was just rambling. Now he wasn't so sure. I should have returned the watch that night, but something in me, perhaps the same curiosity that made me pick it up, held me back. Little did I know that the clock was already starting to mark time of my own life. The next night, the clock seemed even more alive. The ticking, which had previously been just a vibration, now resonated through the house. It was as if each beat was synchronized with my heart, increasing in intensity with each passing hour. I tried to ignore it. I placed the clock in a closet at the end of the hallway, wrapped it in a towel, and closed the door. Still, the sound persisted, muffled but present. Around 11:30 p.m., something strange happened. The lights began to flicker. At first I thought it was an electrical problem. I grabbed my phone to light up the hallway, but when I tried to call the power company, the screen froze. Every hour showed midnight, even if the digital clock in the kitchen showed something else. A peculiar smell began to fill the air, something like burnt wood mixed with rust. I went to the closet where the watch was kept, trying to find a logical explanation. When I opened the door, I felt a wave of cold, as if I had been transported to another place. The clock was there, just as I left it, but the hands were now moving. Slowly, they marked the last seconds before midnight. My breathing became heavy. It was as if something invisible was compressing my chest. When I closed my eyes for a moment, I saw images. An indistinct figure, standing in front of a similar clock, pointing at me. That's when I realized that the ticking sound had stopped. Suddenly, the lights came back, the sound disappeared, and the clock was motionless again. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew the clock was trying to tell me something. I had no idea what he wanted, but one thing was certain. At midnight, it seemed to take on a life of its own. As the minute hand approached midnight, the sound of the ticking returned, this time louder and clearer. Every beat seemed to echo inside my skull, making it impossible to ignore. I sat in the living room, with the clock placed in front of me. There was something hypnotic about the movements of the hands, as if they were dancing to the rhythm of an inaudible melody. The silence of the house was overwhelming, broken only by that repetitive, relentless sound. It was 10 seconds before midnight. The hands began to slow down, as if they wanted to prolong the moment. Then, at the exact moment that midnight came, the ticking stopped completely. The house plunged into an otherworldly silence. Neither the sound of the wind outside, nor the noise of the old heater. Nothing. It was then that I heard something else, a whisper. Tempus mortis. I turned around, expecting to find someone in the room, but I was completely alone. The voice seemed to come from all corners, and, at the same time, from nowhere. Suddenly, the clock began to vibrate. The gears spun wildly, releasing sparks, as a sickly glow emerged from within him. The light was dim, but enough to reveal something that made me freeze. In the shadow cast by the watch, it wasn't just my silhouette. There was another figure there, tall and thin, with long arms and fingers that seemed to reach out towards me. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. The smell of rust and burning wood returned, now so strong that it made my stomach turn. The clock rang a unique sound, a low dong, like a cathedral bell announcing the end of something. And at that moment, time seemed to stop. My vision blurred, and everything around me disappeared. I was in another place, a dark, doorless room, where the only visible object was a clock identical to the one in my house. The hands of this clock were moving fast, turning in reverse. And in the center of the dial, where the number 12 would normally be, I saw something disturbing. My own reflection, looking at me with eyes that were not mine. The darkness around me was dense, almost palpable. The only sound was that of the hands turning on the clock, that insane movement that seemed to tear the very fabric of time. As I watched, I noticed something strange on the dial, delicate engravings that weren't there before. I approached hesitantly, my reflection still staring at me from inside the watch. The engravings began to take shape, faces, dozens of them, twisted into expressions of pain and terror. Their mouths seemed to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, my grandfather's voice echoed in the darkness. "I told you so. Do not touch the watch." I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. My heart beat out of step as the figures on the dials became clearer. One of them was unmistakable, my grandfather's face. His words came back to my mind, louder and clearer this time. He would talk about the clock on drunken nights, muttering about the price of stolen time. I remembered something he said repeatedly. "This clock doesn't give time, it does." The realization hit me like a blow. That was not a simple cursed object. It was an instrument, a trap built to collect something far more valuable than time. The clock seemed to react to my understanding. The gears stopped, and the reflection on the glass changed again. Now I was a version of myself, but pale with sunken, empty eyes, a corpse that seemed trapped inside that small space. I tried to look away, but it was impossible. My eye in reflection spoke, in a cold and lifeless voice. "The time is coming. You can't escape." With these words, the dark room began to crumble. The walls crumbled in a storm of dust and shadows. I returned to my living room, lying on the floor, panting. The clock was in the same place, motionless as always. But something was different. Now I knew what he did, and the scariest thing? He was still working, just waiting for the right moment to make his next move. The following days were a blur. I tried to live my life normally, but the clock wouldn't leave me alone. Even when I was out and about, I heard that ticking, ghostly drum in the back of my mind. I talked to a local antique dealer, hoping to find some explanation. When I showed him the picture of the watch, the man turned pale. He asked, almost whispering. I told him about my grandfather and the watch. He shook his head, muttering something about the cycle of 12 and the inevitable charge. After insisting, he revealed to me what he knew. This watch was made in the 18th century by a watchmaker obsessed with the idea of imprisoning souls. It is said that he managed to build something that transcended time. But there is a price. With each stroke at midnight, it takes a piece of the life of those who possess it. My stomach turned. Every beat, every sound, every instant I spent near that object was slowly draining me. I looked at my hands. They looked paler, with wrinkles that weren't there before. I decided to end it once and for all. When night came, I prepared to destroy the watch. I took a heavy hammer and placed the object on the living room table. But as soon as I raised the hammer, the ticking began again, louder and faster. The room grew cold, and the lights flickered. It was as if the clock knew what I was about to do and was defending itself. Suddenly, the second hand turned frantically, stopping exactly at midnight. A low-pitched sound echoed through the house, like the ringing of a bell. The clock opened, revealing a glowing internal mechanism, beating like a living heart. I felt a tug, as if something was trying to drag me into it. Then I heard my grandfather's voice once more. There's only one way to end this. You need to replace the time it has already taken. In the reflection of the glass of the watch, I saw the faces of all the people he had imprisoned. My grandfather was among them, reaching out to me. The message was clear. Someone needed to take my place. I hesitated, but the watch gave me no choice. The vibration increased, and the last thing I heard was the sound of the hammer falling to the ground. When I woke up, the clock was intact, but something was different. The house seemed emptier, and the mirror on the wall no longer reflected my image. The clock was now silent, and the hands did not move. But I know it's only a matter of time before he chooses his next victim. I never liked parties. I always found the noise, the flashing lights and people talking loudly at the same time unbearable. But that year, something in me told me that I needed to celebrate. Maybe it was accumulated fatigue or the desire to change something in my life. Maybe. I then decided to open my house for a New Year's Eve party, something small, just close friends. Little did I know that this decision would be the beginning of a night that I would never forget. It was supposed to be a common celebration, with food, laughter, and toasts. But deep down, something seemed out of place from the start. It was a strange feeling, as if my home was no longer just mine. It was only when the clock started to approach midnight that I realized we had one more guest. Someone no one had called. The afternoon of that day was a rush. I decorated every corner of the house, filled the fridge with drinks, and prepared the perfect playlist. Even with everything in place, I still felt a weight in the air, as if something was watching me. But I ignored it. It was just anxiety, I thought. The first guests arrived punctually at 8 a.m. My closest friends, always punctual and full of energy. The sound of laughter filled the house quickly, and for a moment, I even managed to relax. While everyone was having fun, I went upstairs to my room to pick up something I had forgotten. As I opened the door, I felt the cold air envelop me. The windows were closed, but it seemed that the cold was coming from inside the room. In bed, my reflection in the mirror looked different. For a second, I swore that he had moved before me. I'm just tired, I thought, shaking my head to shake off the discomfort. I went down again, but that feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The party was still lively, and everyone seemed happy. But amid the noise of conversations and the clinking of glasses, I noticed something strange. In one of the photos we took together, there was a silhouette in the background, a person I was sure I hadn't invited. The party was at its peak. Laughter, loud music, and the sound of toasts filled the house. I found myself finally relaxing, almost forgetting the nagging feeling from earlier. But as I looked at the crowded room, something caught my attention. Leaning against the door was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, wearing an impeccable black suit, He held a glass of wine as if he were completely at ease. "Hey, who's that?" I whispered to my friend Sarah, pointing discreetly. She looked frowning. "Oh, I don't know. I thought it was a friend of yours." I walked past the guests, trying to disguise my uneasiness, but no one knew who he was. I asked at least 5 people, and they all gave the same answer. "I thought you invited him." The stranger seemed to realize that I was watching him. When our gazes met, he smiled a thin, almost mechanical grin. Something in his eyes made me shudder. They looked too much fun, as if there was nothing behind it. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was just a crasher, someone who took advantage of the movement to get in. But there was something about him that didn't fit. He didn't laugh like the others. He didn't talk. Alone, watched. "Hey, man," I called, finally gathering my courage. "Do you know anyone here?" He looked at me, and for a moment the sound of the party seemed to subside. The smile remained on his face, but he did not answer. He just raised his glass as if toasting with me and walked away, disappearing among the guests. The night wore on, and the mood began to change. Some people noticed that the air seemed colder, as if an invisible wind was running through the rooms. I was restless, still trying to locate the stranger who had disappeared among the guests. It was then that someone suggested a game. "Are we going to play Midnight Questions? They say it's perfect for New Year's Eve parties." Everyone agreed excitedly, except me. Something about that made me uncomfortable. "How does it work?" I asked, trying not to sound hostile. "It's simple," Sarah replied. "Each person asks a question, and those who don't answer have to pay a challenge. They say that the game reveals things that you might not want to know." The idea seemed harmless, but when we started, the air became heavy. The stranger reappeared. Without saying anything, he sat around the table with us, as if he had always been there. The questions started lightly. "What is your biggest fear? What's the worst lie you've ever told?" But when it was the man's turn, his question made the mood change for good. "Who here has something to hide?" Everyone laughed, but the laughter died quickly. The question seemed more directed at each of us than at the group as a whole. I shifted in my chair, uncomfortable. Why did that question seem so stiff? On my turn to answer, I felt a shiver go up my spine. I looked at him, and he just tilted his head, as if expecting something specific from me. Before he could say anything, the lights flickered, and the music stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room seemed paralyzed, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise or fear. The stranger, however, seemed more at ease than ever, as if he had waited for this moment. He stood up slowly, and the sound of footsteps echoed louder than it should. Something was wrong, and now there was no way to ignore it. "You wonder who I am, don't you?" He finally spoke, his voice low and mesmerizing. "But the real question is, why am I here?" No one answered. One of my friends tried to laugh, but the attempt sounded nervous and out of place. I felt my legs wobbly, but I managed to muster the strength to say, "Look, if this is some kind of joke, it's enough. Who invited you to this party?" He tilted his head, as if reflecting on my question. Then, with a cold smile, he replied, "I have not been called, but someone here brought me." His words echoed in the room. Someone choked on the drink, and a cup fell to the ground, shattering. My heart raced. Something in his tone suggested that it was not a metaphor. "What are you talking about?" I insisted. My voice sounded louder than I intended, and all eyes turned to me. He stepped forward, and I instinctively retreated. "You opened the door and I walked in. It's that simple." Before I could answer, the lights flashed again. But this time, when they returned, the room looked different. The furniture was in the same place, but the colors seemed muted, as if all the vitality had been drained from the room. The others began to notice as well. Sarah looked around, confused, and said in a whisper, "What's going on? Why does it all seem wrong?" The man smiled once more, but this time his teeth seemed sharper. "The clock is ticking," he said, looking at the clock on the wall. "And when midnight comes, you will have to decide." "Decide what?" I asked, my voice trembling. He moved closer, his face now inches from mine. His gaze seemed to penetrate directly into my soul. Who goes with me? The countdown to midnight has begun. 10, 9, 8. The room was plunged into unbearable tension. The lights flickered erratically, and the clock on the wall seemed louder with each passing second. I tried to understand what the stranger meant. Who's going with me? What did that mean? Who was he? But before he could put the pieces together, he raised his glass again, as if toasting something invisible. If no one chooses, I'll choose for you, he said calmly. His voice was low, but it seemed to fill the space, drowning out all other sounds. 6, 5, 4. Some people started running to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was alive, locking everyone inside. Others tried to scream, but no sound came out. 3, 2. Wait, I shouted, trying to buy time. Why are you doing this? Who are you really? He looked at me, almost as if he was having fun. I'm just the guest. And every party needs an ending, doesn't it? 1. The clock struck midnight, and everything froze. Literally. The air became so cold that my breath came out like mist. People's faces looked petrified, but I could still move. The stranger, however, was sharper than ever. So, who's it going to be? He reached out to me. No, I shouted. No one is going with you. He laughed, a low laugh that seemed to reverberate inside my head. But that's how it works. You open the door, and now it needs to be closed. With someone on the other side, I felt a tug, as if something invisible was dragging me. Everything around me went dark except for the stranger and his outstretched hand. With a final effort, I closed my eyes and shouted, "Go away! You are not welcome here." When I opened my eyes, he was gone. The room was empty except for me. There was no sign of anyone, not my friends, not the party. Just the clock which struck exactly midnight, and the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. So, which of these 3 horror reports at the turn of the year was the scariest for you? Or did any of them remind you of something you've already experienced? Comment below, I really want to know your opinion. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories like these. Until next time, if you dare to come back,